The sun was just rising behind the mountains when a shout tore through the small wooden house, slicing the morning silence like a blade. The deep voice of Augusto, the family patriarch, echoed with harshness and impatience. "You'll never amount to anything in life, boy. You're useless, nothing but a burden and a disgrace to me." The words hit Raphael like stones, crushing what little hope he still carried in his heart. He was only 17, but he already knew too well the weight of his father's contempt. He had grown up hearing he wasn't enough, that he would never have value. His mother, Helena, always tried to intervene, but was silenced by her husband's authoritarian glare. But that day, something changed. Raphael didn't cry. He simply lowered his head, storing every word as if it were fuel. In silence, he swore to himself that one day he would prove to his father and to everyone that he was not the failure they claimed. The house they lived in was modest, nearly falling apart. Augusto worked in a small repair shop but had never accepted the idea that his son might dream of something different. To him, Raphael was supposed to follow in his footsteps, get his hands greasy, and resign himself to the same limited life. But the boy had other plans. Since childhood, he devoured books about business, technology, and the stories of great entrepreneurs. He filled notebooks with ideas, sketches, and even designs for inventions no one ever took seriously. That morning, after being humiliated once again, the flame inside Raphael only grew stronger. His father sneered as he looked at him with disdain. "You'll end up like every other failed dreamer, begging in the streets. Mark my words, boy, you'll never be anyone." Helena, with tears in her eyes, tried to defend her son. "Augusto, don't speak to him like that. He just wants a chance. Can't you see he has talent?" But Augusto turned his back, cutting the conversation short with a brusque gesture. In that moment, Raphael understood he couldn't count on support inside that house. If he wanted to succeed, he'd have to do it alone, carrying not only the weight of poverty, but also of rejection. As his father slammed the door on his way to work, Raphael turned to his mother and whispered, "One day, Mom. One day, I'll come back different. And when that day comes, he'll have to swallow every word he said." She just hugged him, knowing her son wasn't speaking out of impulse. There was determination in his voice, a fire in his eyes that mixed pain with hope. The family atmosphere remained heavy. Every meal felt like a battlefield. Every silence a reminder that Raphael didn't belong. His sisters, influenced by their father, mocked him too, calling him a dreamer, as if it were an insult. He was the outsider in his own home. But that same night, lying in his small room with the wooden roof creaking under the wind, Raphael opened one of his notebooks again. On the page, he scribbled in large letters, "I will succeed, no matter how long it takes." His father's words echoed in his mind, not as a sentence of failure anymore, but as the spark that would ignite a journey of resilience. And so began the story of the rejected son, the boy branded by scorn, who swore to himself that one day he would return, not just as a winner, but as a millionaire. Raphael grew up in a home where love seemed rationed and recognition was non-existent. His father, Augusto, had always been a man hardened by life. Raised in poverty, he had learned to work from an early age and believed that any dream beyond survival was a waste of time. So, when he saw his son buried in books, notes, and daydreams about business and inventions, he felt insulted. Helena, on the other hand, was a gentle woman, but fragile in the face of her husband's authoritarian ways. She lived torn between protecting her son and avoiding fights that could end in verbal violence, or worse. Even so, she found ways to secretly encourage him. Sometimes she slipped little notes into his pants pocket. "Believe in yourself," or "Don't give up, you have a gift." These small gestures were what kept Raphael's resilience alive. Raphael's older sisters absorbed their father's ideas. Mariana, the eldest, was Augusto's favorite. She worked with him at the repair shop, learning the trade and earning her father's trust. Luciana, the middle sister, was more distant but never missed an opportunity to remind Raphael of his place. While you're busy daydreaming, Mariana and I are actually helping out. Wake up, Rafa. The world won't hand you anything on a silver platter. The words stung, but they didn't break him. On the contrary, they only reinforced his determination to prove himself. At school, Raphael wasn't very popular. He carried the reputation of being the poor boy from the repair shop. But he constantly surprised teachers with his intelligence and ability to learn quickly. He was the kind of student who could see patterns where others only saw problems. He loved math, economics, and technology. He dreamed of creating solutions that could change people's lives. One afternoon, his math teacher, Mr. Davy, called him after class. "Raphael, have you ever thought about joining math Olympiads or science fairs? You've got real talent, kid. Don't waste it." Raphael smiled shyly but answered honestly, "I'd love to, Professor, but I can't. I can barely afford school supplies, and at home, all I hear is that I'm wasting my time." The teacher sighed, understanding his situation. Still, he promised to help whenever he could. That small gesture became yet another spark of fuel for the boy. In the meantime, Raphael started looking for small jobs in the neighborhood, running deliveries, helping out in grocery stores, even washing cars. Every coin he earned went into a box hidden under his bed. It wasn't much, but to him, it represented independence, a first timid step toward the future he envisioned. At home, however, the contempt only grew stronger. Augusto often compared Raphael to his sisters. "Look at them. Hardworking, responsible, and you? A useless dreamer, dead weight. When I'm gone, Mariana will inherit everything. You won't get a single screw from this shop." Those words struck like blows, but they also shaped a resilient heart. Raphael didn't want the repair shop. He didn't want scraps from his father. He wanted to build something of his own, something so great it would force Augusto to swallow every word of contempt. Helena, noticing her son's growing determination, began supporting him more openly. One night, she handed him an envelope with some savings she had been keeping for years. "Don't tell your father. It's not much, but maybe it'll help you take your first step. I believe in you, my son." Raphael hugged her tightly, overcome with emotion. That small act felt like a breath of life in the middle of suffocation. At that moment, he decided he would not remain trapped in that small town, nor in his father's shadow. The world was vast, and he was going to explore it. And so, at 18 years old, with a backpack on his shoulders, an envelope with a little money, and the silent promise to one day return and prove his worth, Raphael left. He walked away from the repair shop, his sisters, and the father who had rejected him. All he carried with him was his mother's faith and an unbreakable determination. The first years away from home were an unforgiving test for Raphael. He arrived in the big city with no connections, no support, and barely any money. He slept in cheap boarding houses, sometimes sharing a room with strangers. To survive, he took on temporary jobs, washing dishes in restaurants, working as a construction helper, even handing out flyers on the streets. Every night he came back exhausted, but instead of giving in to discouragement, he devoted hours to books and free courses he managed to access at libraries and, later, online. He understood that manual labor would only give him the bare minimum to survive, but knowledge, that would be the key to changing his destiny. While his roommates spent their meager wages on fleeting distractions, Raphael saved every penny. He bought used books, notebooks, and eventually managed to get a second-hand laptop, which became his most precious treasure. Sleepless nights were now dedicated to learning about business, programming, and investments. He devoured stories of entrepreneurs who had started with nothing and rose to global prominence. He read biographies, studied spreadsheets, and practiced calculations endlessly, as if preparing for an opportunity that had yet to arrive. But the path was anything but easy. Hunger and exhaustion often pushed him to the brink of giving up. On some days, his father's words, "You'll never achieve anything in life," echoed like poison in his mind. Yet, instead of breaking him, they reminded him of the promise he had made, to prove that his worth did not depend on his father's approval. It was while washing dishes at a restaurant that he met Jonas, an engineering student who interned during the day and worked nights as a waiter. Jonas noticed Raphael's interest in technology when he saw him reading programming books during a break. "Do you actually understand this stuff?" Jonas asked, flipping through a notebook filled with handwritten notes. Raphael nodded shyly. "I try. Honestly, it's what motivates me most. One day, I want to build something of my own." Impressed, Jonas began encouraging him. He shared materials, introduced Raphael to online communities, and little by little, Raphael started developing real skills. Together, they began working on small projects, websites, simple apps, and basic systems for local shopkeepers. They didn't earn much, but every satisfied client was another step upward. Over time, Raphael realized that technical talent alone wasn't enough. He needed business vision. He began studying the digital market, startups, and how small ideas could grow into million-dollar companies. With each completed project, he gained confidence and credibility. Still, the shadow of his past lingered. Some nights, lying in his cramped boarding house room, he thought about the family he had left behind. He pictured his father, still in the repair shop, convinced that Raphael was destined for failure. Those memories weren't just painful, they were fuel. The turning point came when Raphael and Jonas decided to enter a technology innovation competition hosted by a university. Even though they weren't official students, they managed to register as an independent team. The challenge looked simple on paper but was complex in execution: to create a digital solution that would help small businesses improve their sales. For weeks, they worked day and night. Jonas handled the engineering side, while Raphael led the system development and structured the idea as a viable business. They arrived exhausted on presentation day, but what they delivered shocked everyone. An app that connected local shopkeepers to customers quickly and efficiently, even allowing online orders, something still rare in the region. The project won second place, but it caught the attention of investors in the audience. One of them, intrigued, invited Raphael to a meeting. There, in a glass-walled room of a modern building, Raphael had his first real contact with the world of business he had always dreamed of. The investor didn't put money in right away, but he gave valuable advice, shared contacts, and made Raphael believe he was on the right path. Slowly, life began to change. He left the boarding house, rented a small apartment with Jonas, and together they began shaping a startup. It wasn't easy. Money was still tight, bills piled up, but now there was a greater purpose. During that time, Raphael realized that true victory wasn't just about becoming wealthy. It was about defying the sentence his father had placed upon him. Every line of code he wrote, every client he gained, every obstacle he overcame was a silent slap in Augusto's arrogance. He wasn't a millionaire yet, but he was walking an irreversible path. And within him, a certainty grew stronger. The day he would return and show his father who he truly was drawing near, and when that day came, the impact would be devastating. The days when Raphael washed dishes or carried boxes already felt distant, even though wealth had not yet entered his life. What he did have, however, was something far more powerful: vision and strategy. With Jonas by his side, he began to shape the startup that had once lived only in the scribbles of his old notebooks. The initial idea, connecting small shopkeepers to customers quickly and affordably, needed refinement. They spent countless nights debating, sketching flows on makeshift whiteboards, researching competitors, and mapping opportunities. Raphael's mind was on fire with ideas, but he knew that without a clear plan, they were doomed to fail. It was during this period that a philosophy emerged, one that would guide his entire journey. The pain of the small is the opportunity of the great. He saw that thousands of local shopkeepers struggled due to a lack of accessible technology. If he could deliver a simple, affordable solution, he could change their lives, and his own. The obstacles, however, were enormous. They had no capital, no skilled team, not even a proper office. Working from home was limiting, and the little money they earned barely covered rent and food. Raphael knew they needed investors to scale, but first he had to prove the project had real value. So he decided to build a functional prototype, an MVP, minimum viable product. To make it happen, he saved every penny. He cut down on food, clothes, and any form of leisure. He lived even more frugally, but his eyes never strayed from the future. Jonas, though often doubtful they could push forward, never abandoned him. "Do you really think this is going to work, Rafa?" Jonas asked one night, exhausted after hours of coding. "I don't think. I know. No matter how much it hurts, we're going to make this work." Raphael's determination was unshakable. After months of relentless effort, they finally launched the first version of the app. It was simple, full of bugs, but it worked. Raphael himself hit the streets, knocking on doors, convincing shopkeepers to try it. Many rejected him, some mocked the idea, but a few agreed. And it was those few that proved the project had a future. The first results trickled in. A small neighborhood market reported that its deliveries had doubled. A local bakery increased revenue by 20%. These modest outcomes were the spark Raphael had been waiting for. Armed with real data, he prepared a pitch for investors. He knew this moment would be a turning point. Either he secured funding, or he would go back to zero. For weeks, he rehearsed his speech, refined spreadsheets, and anticipated tough questions. Jonas, ever the pragmatist, warned him, "Investors don't have a heart, Rafa. They want numbers. Just telling your story won't be enough." But Raphael knew he had something stronger than numbers. He had purpose. And on the day of the presentation, he used that to his advantage. With a steady voice and determined eyes, he explained how the platform worked, showed the initial results, and outlined his vision for the future. But above all, he told the story behind the project. The hardships, his father's contempt, and the vow to turn pain into solutions. The silence after his pitch was deafening. Some investors exchanged glances, others flipped through papers with unreadable expressions. Then, a woman at the back of the room stood up. It was Clara Menezes, one of the most respected investors in the sector. "You're not just a young dreamer. You're resilient. And resilience is what separates winners from failures. I'm in." For a few seconds, the world seemed to stop. Raphael felt his legs tremble but kept his composure. Clara not only invested an initial sum but also opened doors to networks that once felt unreachable. With that boost, the startup took its first steps toward becoming professional. They hired developers, rented a small office, and began expanding their client base. Every new challenge rose like a towering wall, but Raphael learned to climb each one. And yet, despite the victories, his father's ghost never left him. Every time he celebrated, he heard again that old sentence, "You'll never achieve anything in life." Now, with the business beginning to take shape, he felt that the time to shatter that curse was drawing near. Raphael didn't just want to be a successful entrepreneur. He wanted to be living proof that no one has the right to define another person's destiny. Above all, he wanted to look his father in the eyes and show him that the useless son now led something far greater than the rusty workshop that had once been his prison. The planning was done. The foundations were laid. The climb to the top had begun. Years had passed since Raphael had left home with nothing but a backpack and a promise to change his own destiny. Now, sitting in the glass-walled office of his company, he gazed at the city stretching out to the horizon. Skyscrapers, lights, and constant movement. This was the stage of victory he had built with sweat, tears, and sleepless nights. His startup was no longer just a daring experiment. It had become one of the most promising tech companies in the country. Hundreds of employees, thousands of clients, and million-dollar contracts were now under his command. With every new milestone, newspapers and magazines exalted his story as that of the poor boy who defied the odds and built an empire. But destiny had plans to bring his past back to his doorstep. One day, his secretary announced unexpected visitors. When Raphael entered the conference room, he found himself face to face with figures he hadn't seen in years. His father, Augusto, aged and hardened, his once harsh face now lined with bitterness. Mariana, the eldest sister, still clinging to arrogance despite her troubles. And Luciana, quieter, her eyes heavy with tension. For a moment, silence filled the room. Past and present collided in that glass chamber. Raphael. Augusto's voice was lower than he remembered. "We need to talk to you." Raphael remained standing, studying them. Inside, his heart raced, but outwardly his posture was firm, almost cold. It was Mariana who hurried to explain. The workshop, once the pride of the family, was on the brink of bankruptcy. Debts had piled up, clients had vanished, and creditors were at the door. With no way out, they had turned to the very son they once despised. "You have resources, Rafa. You can help us. We're your family," Mariana said, trying to sound conciliatory. But Raphael only raised an eyebrow. "Family?" he repeated, almost with irony. "Interesting how that word comes up now. Where was this family when I needed support? When I was called useless in my own house?" The weight of his words fell on them like a hammer. Luciana tried to intervene, murmuring that the past didn't matter anymore, but Raphael cut her off. "The past does matter, because it was there that you taught me a lesson I never forgot, that I was worth nothing to you. And now that you're on your knees, suddenly you remember me. Don't you find that curious?" Augusto's face hardened. Too proud to beg, but crushed by reality, he tried to salvage a shred of authority. "You're my son. You're obligated to help." The phrase echoed in the room, but Raphael only smiled, a cold, ironic smile. "Obligation? The only obligation I ever had was to myself. You rejected me, humiliated me, told me I'd never be anything. Now look." He spread his arms, pointing to the sleek modern office around them. "This is the result of the useless boy you cast aside." Silence returned, heavier this time. None of them dared respond. This was the confrontation Raphael had awaited for years, and finally, he was in control. Then he made the decision that would forever define his relationship with his family. "No, I will not save the workshop. It will fall, just as you once let me fall. And when it does, maybe you'll finally understand that the one you called worthless was, in fact, the only one capable of building something from nothing." Mariana's eyes widened in disbelief. Luciana lowered her head in silence, and Augusto, the man who had never shown weakness, turned pale, as if the weight of all his past choices had finally crushed him. Raphael didn't raise his voice, didn't slam the table, didn't need any grand gestures. His calmness was more devastating than any outburst of rage. It was the silent triumph of the rejected son over those who had once laughed at him. At the end of the meeting, he stood and opened the door, signaling the conversation was over. "You can leave. My life moves forward. You chose your destiny a long time ago." As his family walked out in silence, Raphael remained alone, staring at the city from above once more. Part of him ached from the final break, but another, the deepest part, felt the sharp relief of justice. The confrontation was over. The emotional debt had been paid. After the door closed behind his father and sisters, Raphael remained silent, staring at his own reflection in the glass. On the outside, he was the powerful CEO who had conquered everything. On the inside, he still carried the scar of a rejected son. Victory tasted like justice, but also like emptiness. The following days were intense. News that the family's old workshop was on the verge of bankruptcy spread quickly through his hometown. Raphael didn't reach out, but local newspapers began publishing stories, and soon the headline echoed everywhere. The rejected son who became a millionaire and refused to save his family's business. Even while trying to keep his mind focused on the company, Raphael couldn't stop the memories. He recalled the nights when his mother, Helena, secretly supported him. She was the one who believed in him when everyone else called him worthless. Without her, he might never have had the strength to move forward. And now, in the middle of all the emotional storm, a letter reached him. It was from his mother. With trembling hands, Raphael opened the envelope. The handwriting was delicate, yet firm. "My son, if this letter has reached you, it means I finally found the courage to write. I know your life has changed, and I am proud of you. I always knew you were special, even when your father refused to see it. I want you to remember one thing. Vengeance may give the feeling of victory, but it is forgiveness that truly sets us free. Don't ask yourself to forget, but allow yourself to move on in peace. With love, your mother." The words struck Raphael like an arrow. For the first time, he realized that even though he had won the battle against his father, he was still emotionally chained to the wounds of the past. That same week, news came that Augusto had suffered a collapse. The pride he had carried for decades no longer found strength in his weakened body. The man who once seemed unshakable now lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by memories of a ruined empire and the choices that had driven away his most talented son. Raphael went to see him quietly, without announcing his visit. In the small hospital room, he found his father lying, pale, weary eyes fixed on the ceiling. When Augusto noticed his son at the door, he tried to speak, but his voice failed. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with years of pain. Then, in an unexpected gesture, Raphael simply said, "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because the one thing you could never take from me was my heart." Augusto closed his eyes and a solitary tear rolled down his face. No apology left his lips, but in that silent gesture, Raphael understood that in some way, his father acknowledged defeat. The next day, back at the office, Raphael called an extraordinary meeting. To everyone's surprise, he announced the creation of a fund to support small, struggling businesses. It wasn't about saving his father's workshop. That was doomed by its own wrong choices. It was about transforming pain into something greater, about helping people who, like him once, had been told they would never succeed. The room applauded. But Raphael knew, deep inside, it wasn't just philanthropy. It was his way of closing the chapter of his story, a way to show the world, and himself, that he didn't need to become the man who once rejected him. And so, the turnaround was complete. The rejected son had not only risen and built an empire, but also chosen the nobility of forgiveness, creating a legacy greater than his pain. The sun was setting behind the skyscrapers when Raphael closed his laptop and gazed at the city below. Every light shining was a story, a destiny, a personal battle. His own, as painful as it had been, now carried a greater purpose. The support fund he had created was already gaining visibility. Small shopkeepers, indebted families, and young entrepreneurs saw in it a real chance to start over. To the media, Raphael was no longer just a successful CEO, but a symbol of transformation. A man who had overcome scorn and chose to give back in the form of opportunity. Still, his soul was not free of scars. He carried the memory of nights crying alone, of the echo of his father's voice saying, "You will never achieve anything in life." Those words would never vanish, but now they were no longer a sentence. They were fuel, proof that no one has the right to determine another person's future. One day, walking near the hospital where his father was still recovering, Raphael was stopped by an elderly woman carrying grocery bags. She held his hand tightly and said, "You don't know me, but I know your story. My husband and I were about to lose our bakery. It was your fund that saved us. My son didn't have to drop out of school. Thank you for believing in us." In that moment, Raphael felt a different warmth in his chest. stronger than any profit, any headline, any victory over his father. It was the feeling of finally breaking the cycle. The following night, alone at home, he opened his mother's old letter once again. Rereading her words about forgiveness made him finally understand. True triumph was not in watching his family fail, but in finding his own strength when no one else believed. And looking ahead, Raphael knew there would still be challenges, setbacks, and criticism. But he also knew nothing would ever make him return to being that rejected boy. He was now the man who turned pain into legacy. Raphael's story was not just about revenge or redemption. It was about the resilience born from rejection, about how scorn can be transformed into courage, about how even the deepest wounds can become seeds of change. And for all those who have ever heard someone say, "You will never achieve anything in life," Raphael's life carried a clear message. What defines your destiny is not the voice of those who tear you down, but the strength you find to rise again.